So I hit pause on this for a little while just because I was waiting on these bearings to come in. But instead of just throwing bearings in this and putting it all back together, I actually really wanted to get to the bottom of what's actually happening here. So yeah, if you didn't watch the last video, this is what the bearings look like coming out of it. Like, they all look kind of messed up, but they didn't contact the crank or anything. It didn't lose oil pressure. It could have had more oil pressure, but yeah. So I was thinking this might have been a defective set of bearings because the babbitt is literally like flaking off of it, leaving the copper layer. Apparently, after doing some reading, that's what everyone thinks when they see stuff like this. And what it actually is cavitation. So if you can imagine, you have two pieces of glass and then you have a droplet of oil in between. If you sandwich the glass together, you'll see the droplet spread out. But if you pull it away, you'll see the drop kind of try to come back to one, but it'll be all spread out and there'll be air pockets in it, kind of thing. And if you shove the glass back down again, you're going to be compressing all those air pockets, right? That's sort of what's happening with the rod bearings. We're basically creating air pockets in the rod bearing due to not enough oil flow. And then we're compressing those air pockets and then loading the bearing unevenly on the babbitt layer. And then the bearing's getting hammered the other way. And then now it's being sucked away. Now it's sucking on those spots of the babbitt that it was once pushing on. And this is all because the oil's leaving the bearing faster than it's going in. So that's where the air bubbles are coming from in the first place. And then that repeats like, I don't know, 8,000 times a minute basically, right? So after a whole season of that, just not getting enough oil to the rods, then now the bearings look like this. But there's just enough oil for it to not contact the journal. But bottom line is we need more oil to the rods. So, okay, how do we fix that? If I had a 4-stage pump with a pressure stage, I could just crank the oil pressure up and then hopefully fix it. But the problem is I run a stock pump for pressure. So I can't really turn that up anymore because we're basically maxed on that. When the oil's up to temp, the regulator doesn't even open at high RPM because it just demands that much oil. So I was thinking, okay, maybe use a bigger pump from an older model, but I'm not going to do that because you can't even get replacements for those, and that might not even be enough still. So my solution is kind of boiled down to tightening up these main bearings so I can actually get more oil through the crank to the rods. And then by tightening those up, maybe a thou all the way across, then I can actually run thinner oil, which will make it easier for the oil to flow through the crank and then to the rods. Because I run a 60 weight and then half the time I'm firing this car up cold and just going straight out on track. Wait, they're going? The oil definitely isn't flowing through the crank properly, being a 60 weight at like 40-degree oil temperatures. So that's probably why they look like this as well. So bottom line is tighten up the mains. They were really loose because I figured the crank would be flexing a lot, revving higher than stock and whatever, just giving it extra safety margin. But it turns out I don't really need that. So I can tighten these all up, get more global oil pressure throughout the whole engine, and then get more oil to those rods, and then use thinner oil so it flows better. And then hopefully I can mitigate this cavitation problem. It's also worth noting that there's racing bearings that are designed for this exact type of cavitation and abuse. Like a King racing bearing or an ACL or something, they're a lot harder, so they can actually take the abuse of there being voids in the oil film and uneven loading and whatnot and not fall apart or last longer under these conditions. I've had a set of King bearings in another engine before and they work great. I don't have an issue with them, but I kind of like these, the OEM soft bearings, just because if something happens and they do contact the crank, they don't leave much of anything on it. But the Kings or the hard bearings, if something goes wrong and they hit the crank, they really chew up the crank just because of how hard they are. So the way I'm going to adjust the main clearances is I'm just going to use different shells on one half. So I'm going to change out the bottom side, so the cap side shells, to thicker shells. Another thing to note is that main number 3 had the tightest clearance, which is this one here. And then that one feeds rod number 2, which is this one. And rod number 2, coincidentally, looks the best. These marks are from measuring it, by the way. So the way it works in these engines is number 1 doesn't feed anything, number 2 feeds 1, number 3 feeds 2, and then number 4 feeds 3, and number 5 feeds 4. So I just swapped out the bottom shells for number 1 and number 5. And luckily, let's see, it's kind of in the right spot to measure it on camera anyway. We got number 5 right at around 22 thou, so 0 is where it was zeroed at. 8 would be 2 thou clearance, so it's like 22 10,000ths, I should say, not thou. Keep making that mistake. So that's actually the number I had in mind, which, so it's looking good. That one's about the same, so I'm going to check the other 3. And then we should have our clearances there. Hopefully these rod bearings actually clearance a bit tighter too, because then that would be fantastic for the setup. Yeah, I'm not liking this one. It's tighter on this side of the bearing than that side for some reason. Yeah, these are all pretty damn spot on at 22. Except for the third one. This side of the third one is like 18 tenths for some reason. Because like the cap is probably sitting that way or something like that. We'll deal with it. It probably is the case. So we got 22 to 20, 22, 22, 22 to 20. So that's good. And then sideways we got 35, 35. 30. 40. Whoa. Yeah, that means it's off 5 thou there. And we got 22. We're gonna have 50 here or something. I got 35. While you buy more than one set of bearings for anything, even if they're the same type, you just never know when there's some small defects or something. Because like I just had to mix and match some shells to get the side clearance the way I wanted it to be. So these all look good, except for 3. I gotta play with 3, and then crank can go in. Yes, these are polished. Spinning nice. These are the clearances we ended up with. So like 20 thou, give or take. Center one was 19 thou on one side of the bearing. Yeah, this block could use a line hone next time it's apart, but we made it work. So the loose mains I still think are the best way, but I just simply don't have enough oil pump for it. So here's what we got in these rods. Just torqued them all down and measured them. Had to swap out shells on number 1 because that didn't look completely right. So that's why you always buy 2 sets. But yeah, basically we have 20 thou all the way across vertical on the rod bearings, which is great. So it is tighter than those other bearings that I had. Those are a different sort of off-brand, but anyway, that's good. That helps us. And then we have 25 thou side clearance all the way across, 26 on number 4 and 23 on number 1. So a little bit tighter, a little bit less eccentricity on number 1, but we're literally splitting hairs here. Those can go in. Just gonna measure the bores real quick. Just going right back in with the same ring pack and everything because nothing really needs to be changed. Gonna clean up this deck surface after I put the pistons in so I don't drop stuff onto the crank. And then I can just wipe out the bores. There's like half a thou to maybe a thou of wear in each cylinder, and that's not even a problem because that's before it was honed the last time, so the crosshatch is still there.
Them love my style, you're well versatile. Drop it like a bomb, drop it like a
Possible way. Anais featuring Red Fox and Formula and Take It Easy. Anais, the name that you really need to know about at a rising side job based on Mopia.
So yeah, I didn't even film putting the pistons in. You've probably seen that a million times by now. But anyway, they're in. What you need to know is these are stock pistons. You can see, where does it say? They say Saab somewhere on there. Yeah, upside down there. So yeah, these are stock pistons. I just like to mirror polish the faces. They just reflect a bit of heat and stuff doesn't stick to them as much. I didn't do a crazy good job cleaning them because they're just gonna go right back in and get fired up again. Stock ring gaps, everything stock bore size. It's got a light hone, so it's like probably half a thou to a thou looser than a factory bore. So yeah, and actually the stock ring gap is like 26 thou or something like that, which is like huge for a factory engine. It's actually, the gap is actually big enough to be a nitrous gap, which is pretty wild for a factory car. I don't know what they thought was gonna happen to these engines. So beyond that, those are in. I cleaned up the head surface a bit. This was resurfaced before I put the head on last time, so all of this nastiness here is just surface rust from water leaking in the beginning and then, you know, exposed to the elements. So the head gasket doesn't even touch these spots, so I just got to make sure around the coolant ports are good so the water seals, and then, you know, where the firings go are actually clean already. So as long as it's flat, we're good. I do have that new plate going in, or head gasket, whatever you want to call it. Vent plate, whatever, but I'm waiting on new firings to be made because I'm just going a little bit thicker so that they dig into the head a bit more. You can see actually, yeah, you can see really light grooves. Yep, right there. That's where the firings dig into the head and actually do their sealing. So yeah, these were sealing completely fine, but I reused those rings, like the plate and the rings, probably like 4 times. So I had it on this engine in the beginning to test it. I took it off, I put it back on, and then I locked this engine up in 2020 and then put another engine in with that gasket and ran that, and then rebuilt this and then put that gasket into this, and then now it's off again. Like I reused it so many times and I've gotten away with it. So yeah, finally going to thicker rings on that. Nothing else more to say about that. I was gonna put the whole timing set on, but I was debating on restricting oil to the head. So this is the oil feed to the head. This is like 6 point something mil. And then when you have a lot more oil pressure on these engines, the oil tends to go straight to the head, because once you block off this balance shaft port and all the other ones, and then block off the tensioner, now the pathway to the head is getting a lot more oil than it used to. My problem with it is, if the oil pressure doesn't have to be going to the head, I'd rather have it go to the bottom end. So I don't think we're gonna have problems with oil pressure with the tighter clearances. It never really was a problem. So if I get like 10, 15 more PSI, we're set. But if we get 10, 15 more PSI, now we're flowing more to the head, and then more has to drain out, and then more is coming from the valve cover back to the tank. And you know the deal with that. So anyway, what I want to do is just put a little set screw in here, like a NPT aluminum one that I can drill out. And then just restrict that from 6 mil-ish to maybe 5.5 or 4. So that's just going to be a little work. So I actually have to wait to do that before I put the timing cover on, because when I tap and do that, it's going to put shavings in it. So I'm going to have to plug this because of the way it's drilled. It's kind of hard to just explain it without you seeing it. But the way it's drilled, I got to wait so I can clean out the gallery. And then I can put the timing set back on.